Welcome to our discussion of urban America in the Gilded Age from the end of the Civil War to around 1900. Now, there's a tremendous demand for labor in the cities, in the factories that were located either in the cities themselves or on the very edge of them, and then a greatly increased demand for labor in the stores and the many, many new businesses being started in cities. This demand for labor was met in two ways. One was migration from farms and small towns to the cities. So these are people moving within the United States. And then also a massive wave of new immigrants coming into the United States in the roughly 40 years after the Civil War. In this slide, you can see the cities in 1800, and the next slide will look 40 years later in 1920. Now, as you focus on this, the color of green denotes the percentage of population living in cities, or I should say the shade of green. The darkest green is over 60% of the population living in cities, and you can see Boston, Massachusetts, New York City, the Northeast area, the states of New York, Pennsylvania. But you can also see in California, it's a darker shade of green, quite surprising. And then you can see as the shades get lighter, Texas at that time, under 20% of the population lived in cities. Now let's move forward 40 years to 1920. Here we have a tremendous increase in the number of states in which over 60% of the population lives in cities. You can see Illinois with Chicago there. You can see the northern part of the eastern half of the United States. I won't go through all the states. And this is the great increase in industry in large industrial cities such as Detroit, Michigan, Cleveland, Ohio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, etc., etc. You also see California. And here in Texas, you see by 1920, between 40 and 60% of the population was living in cities, but generally a huge increase. Now, because I'm recording using PowerPoint slides, I can't jump back to our previous slide, but I encourage you right now to stop the recording, reverse, go back about 10 or 15 seconds, and look at the previous slide, and you can see the significant change in the number of people living in cities between 1880 and 1920. Now here we have a graph. The horizontal axis, the years, the vertical axis, or in algebra, the y-axis, are the number of people in millions. And don't get too caught up on the details, but you can see the lower portion of the graph in sort of the orangish color are people living in rural areas. These would be farms or small towns of less than 2,500 people. You can see by 1910 that's still over half the population of the United States. But the segment of interest is the middle one there, the bluish color. Those are people living in towns between 2,500 and 500,000 people, and how that greatly increases both in absolute terms and as a share of the total population. And then finally, the very upper band, purplish color, is people living in cities with more than 500,000 people. This would be places like New York City, etc. So in general, a shift from farms, small towns to the cities. And as we'll see in subsequent lectures, this obviously is going to have an impact on national politics. Let's consider for just one moment the impact of technology in helping or leading to the growth of cities. As I mentioned, one of the pull factors, a major one, were the new factories. And as we've seen previously, these factories were using new technologies, and they wanted to concentrate as many people as possible to use the new machinery. But now more people could live in a given area in a city. Why? Well, first of all, they could build apartment buildings, large apartment buildings. They're also sometimes called tenements. And you no longer had to have space in the buildings. And we're talking about the northern part of the United States now, where it's cold for 5-6 months of the year. You need heat. It's not like a winter in Houston. It's much, much colder. And so they're replacing fireplaces and chimneys in the apartment buildings. So no longer does each apartment have a fireplace or chimney, or several. They're using steam radiators. And these steam radiators are used in some cities. In New York City, my apartment building in Washington, D.C. had this type of heating. They have a central steam plant, which, as the name suggests, boils water. The steam goes through pipes, and those pipes come along your apartment, in the wall or near the wall. And then you have a radiator, looks a bit like a car radiator. It's the steam goes through there, and that gets hot, and that heats up the apartment. Well, the net impact of this is you don't have to have all this space for chimneys and fireplaces. It also, by the way, greatly, greatly reduces the risk of fire. So now you could have fairly inexpensive construction to build large apartment buildings. Well, you could build large apartment buildings that were higher. Why? Because now you had elevators with electric motors, very inexpensive electric motors, particularly in the cities where there was widespread electricity. You had buildings with steel frames, and so the actual structure of the building was the framework of steel girders, and everything else on the outside was just ornamentation. And you also had streetcars, electric streetcars. We'll have a photograph of one in a moment. And commuter railway lines leading to the suburbs. So you could have people, as they moved into the middle class and wealthier, they didn't want to stay in the cities because of the noise, the dirt, the smell. And so what they did is they moved out to the suburbs. But of course, they could easily now get into the cities. They no longer had to walk. They could get there quickly. And so it started the growth of suburbs. This is one of the first skyscrapers. And this was built actually in St. Louis, Missouri. And this was rather famous at the time because it was considered a skyscraper. Now I don't think any of us would call it a skyscraper. It's not particularly high, but it's in St. Louis, Missouri. Now, I mentioned a moment ago streetcars that would take people out to the suburbs, and of course they provided transportation within the city. This is photographed from 1906 in Chicago, Illinois, of the electric streetcar. And if you look above the streetcars, you can see the wires. There are very few of these left in the United States like this. The cable cars in San Francisco, which are a lot of fun to take as tourists, they look like this. And many European cities still today have electric streetcars with the electricity provided by the wires above the streetcar. And it's interesting, you can note here the mud on the streets, or there may be pavement underneath, but people are still using horses. You can see in the far left of the photograph where you see the man and woman walking across the street, and if you look carefully you can see the head of a horse and the neck of a horse there. Now people's dream then, and for many, many years afterwards, was to have a suburban house with detached single-family house. This is sort of the dream photograph. You have the kids outside playing in the nice green grass. Uh, Downstairs, you'd have a kitchen, a living room, and two or three, probably three bedrooms on the upper floor. Um, these houses like this could not be afforded by the average worker in a factory, but there were more and more workers who were moving to be supervisors, but this remained the dream nevertheless. Now, while we just saw the dream house in suburbia, that was out of reach for the vast majority of the workers in the cities. And these are often referred to as the working poor. Working poor because they were employed. And you've got to remember, at this time, there was very little assistance for those who were not working, and it was largely provided by non-governmental institutions such as churches or wealthy people. We'll see later when we get to the Progressive era, like Jane Addams would set up homes to help people. And these people could not obviously afford to buy the houses in the suburbs, nor could they afford to take the streetcar or railroad every day. The population was surging in the cities, so there were more and more people. It became very, very crowded. Some of the poorest workers worked in buildings where there was one toilet per floor, so an average of 20 to 30 people shared a toilet. There were often fires in these buildings, huge increase in violent crime, and obviously these conditions are perfect for the spread of epidemic diseases, whether it's the flu. Cholera was very, very prevalent in large cities, including in the north at this period of time. And the streets were covered with horse urine and manure, which is a polite word for feces. Excuse me, my allergies here. There were almost 500,000 horses in New York City alone at this period of time. And there really were very poorly functioning governments until after 1900. So nobody was really responsible for cleaning the streets. Sometimes farmers would come in at night to get the horse feces or the horse manure off the streets. They would shovel it up and take it off and put it on their fields as a form of fertilizer. But they didn't do that every night. Could you imagine how it smelled, particularly in the summer? And horses were the main means of transportation, not just for people, but particularly to pull carts through the streets. And what happened if, a man had his cart and his horse just collapsed and died, or, whatever, broke a leg? Well, the horses just died on the streets and nobody removed them. So you had rotting horses. It was really gross. Now, there is an e-reader article in this module. It's entitled Urban Pollution many years ago. And it's essentially about this, about the pollution in the cities caused by horses. It's something that you probably don't think about, because if you ever ride horses nowadays, you go to a nice stable and you ride around the trails or the forest. But they were very, very much working horses throughout the United States and, of course, in Europe and other countries at the same time. This is a photograph of Mulberry Street in New York City. And this was in an area with many, many Italian immigrants. And this photo was taken actually in the year 1900. I love it teaching U.S. history. After the Civil War, when we start having photographs, and a little later in the course, we'll actually start having videos of some people, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt giving a speech, et cetera, et cetera. I think it really helps bring history alive. So we look at this. These are apartment buildings. They're called tenements, but this is where the people lived. Down on the bottom floor, you have all sorts of stores. And then you can see in the bottom left an open air market where people would go to shop. You can see on the right the carts. You can see a few horses here or there. It's obviously, a very, very congested street scene. And you can just imagine, given the poor knowledge of medicine then, um, how disease would just um, travel very, very quickly through such areas, or a fire also if one broke out. Now, I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture that the rapid population increase in the cities was due to two factors. One was internal migration within the United States, the other was immigration from other countries. And let me put this in perspective. In 1900, 30% of the people living in major cities in the United States were born in another country. 30%. New York City, 80% of the people residing in New York City in 1900 were born in another country. Now, today, in the United States as a whole, 11% of the people living in the United States were born in another country. That's 1 out of 9, which is still pretty high. The U.S. receives many, many immigrants. But you can see 80% of the people in New York City foreign born. Now, there were two types of immigrants. Be sure you know this distinction. The so-called old immigrants who came before 1880. This isn't referring to the fact that they were old in age when they came, but rather the former type of immigrants. And they were largely Protestants. There were a few Roman Catholics, largely from Ireland. And these immigrants came from Northern and Western Europe. And of course, Ireland is in Northwestern Europe. So those are the old immigrants. The new immigrants after 1880, they tended to come from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. They were mainly Catholics and Jews. Most of the Jews came from Eastern Europe and what's now Russia, and they were coming because of the persecution of Jews there. Jews were often rounded up and killed for their religion. The Catholics were coming largely from Italy. Not too many people came from Spain. Largely Italy and that region. Now, when we look at the photos, which we will, and the living conditions of these immigrants in the large cities, I showed you a minute ago the Mulberry Street, New York City, with the Italian immigrants. We'll see a lot more in subsequent lectures about how they're living in what today we would consider atrocious conditions, great poverty, and social injustices, which there were. But we have to go back in our time machine. At that time, for the immigrants, they considered this much better than where they came from. And in fact, most of them wrote their relatives a letter and said, "It's great over here, come here," because, well, you saw in the previous course, in the 1840s when they had the famous famine in Ireland caused by a fungus in the potato crop, there were many, many people dying in Ireland, dying of starvation. And so they came to the United States. At that time, they clearly faced discrimination for being Catholic. But obviously that's an improvement. They had something to eat. So certainly I'm not justifying, the living conditions or their treatment in factories or whatnot. But for the people themselves, most of them considered it was an improvement. And they were writing their relatives and said, "You must come here." And many of their relatives or friends came. Now, this is Ellis Island. This is a small island in the harbor of New York City. And you can actually go and visit this today. This was the receiving hall where most of the people who came from Europe, and virtually all the immigrants came from Europe. We'll talk a little more about the Chinese in a minute. They would be processed through there. And at that time, they didn't have a visa system like we have now for immigration. They basically went And one of the major things they were looking at was if they had um, some sort of obvious disease like tuberculosis, if someone was coughing all the time and whatnot, because at that time they could diagnose um, tuberculosis, but they had no way to treat tuberculosis effective way until the 1950s with the discovery of antibiotics. But that's what they were essentially looking at. The United States encouraged immigration because there were not enough workers, not only in the factories, but also in many of the large farms that needed workers. So if you're ever in New York City, I encourage you take a boat and a boat for 5 minutes, and you can see Ellis Island. And in fact, a few years ago, I was looking at some of the documents of my parents, and both my father and mother, um, who immigrated from Britain to the United States, they were actually processed at Ellis Island. And I think for many of you, if you look back into your family's genealogy, you'll see that's where they first came into the United States, if you're of European heritage. Now let's take a moment on this, look at this map in some detail. This is 1900. And the main thing I want you to focus on are immigrants as a percentage of total population. And this isn't done so much by states as we saw before, but this is done sort of areas within the United States. If it's dark brownish color, that's 30% or more of the total population are immigrants. Now you can see it, the southern Texas, sort of the Rio Grande Valley, where clearly they came from Mexico. You can, looking at the western part of the United States, you can see in places in Wyoming, Montana, Colorado, Nevada. These are largely mining areas where people came over to get rich quick. Most didn't, and they settled there. You can see it in the northern states, in the center of the country, up Minnesota, Dakota Territory. These were largely immigrants from Northern Europe, from Germany, Scandinavia, Sweden, Finland, Norway, that area, who liked the cold. They were used to living in the cold. It's very cold in Minnesota. It's often referred to as the ice box of the lower 48 states. And they also had lived in forests. There were a lot of forests there, and they went there to work as farmers. There was really no industry there. And if you look, the green line on the around the Midwest United States, that is the urban industrial core area. And we looked at this when we were looking a couple lectures back at the growth of industry. And this is where the large industries started. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, all these areas were really the industrial heartland of the United States in 1920 and for many decades after that. And finally, while we're looking at this map, if you look in the lower left-hand corner, the explanation, the circles for denoting the cities, the large red circle means over 1 million people. And you can see Chicago, Illinois there, and New York City, Philadelphia. They're, I think, the only three that qualify. Then a little smaller red is 500,000 to 1 million people. There are a couple of those. And you'll notice here in Texas, none of our cities made this map. Now, as I mentioned, the so-called new immigrants after 1880 were quite different origin. They had different languages. They obviously didn't speak English. They didn't speak German. And cultural backgrounds. There were many, many Jews, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. They were from what's now Eastern Europe or Russia. There were Eastern Orthodox Christians and Roman Catholics. Now, there was in the United States what's normally called a Nativist Response. These are the people, we're not talking about the Native Americans, the indigenous people here. What we're talking about are the earlier immigrants who came, were either British or German, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestants. They claimed that they were superior to the new immigrants because the new immigrants were from Southern Europe, and they were not Protestant. In addition, at this time in the 1880s, 1890s, some of the leading university professors in sociology and biology claimed that the Southern Europeans, particularly the Italians and Greeks, were of a different race, and that race was inferior to the Anglo-Saxon race in Northern Europe. So we have what's called a nativist response. Again, these are not the Native Americans or the indigenous people responding, but these are the Protestants, Anglo-Protestants. This is a very, very interesting cartoon from Harper's Weekly, a major weekly publication at the time. And this really, really captures, I think, the anti-Catholic sentiment. Now let's look a minute. You have a man standing there on the shore of a lake with children behind him, protecting the children. Who is coming out? At first glance, what do they look like? They look like alligators or crocodiles. But look at it carefully. Look at the one in the front. You see that's not the hand of an alligator. That's the hand of a Roman Catholic bishop. And you can see on his back his robes. And look at the head with what looks like, at first glance, the head of an alligator with teeth. No. If you close that mouth, so-called mouth, that's the hat, the mitre, that a bishop wears, a Catholic bishop wears. So all along here you have Catholic bishops representing the Catholic Church invading the United States. And here you have a man with children, one to the man's right, the man's left. To our right, you have a little boy down kneeling, praying to God, to protect them from the Catholics. Let's look halfway back in the center of the picture. You see it says U.S. Public Schools. Read that. Well, the U.S. public schools are in ruins with the American flag flown upside down. You notice the flag is upside down. And why is that? Well, because the Catholics often put their children in parochial or Catholic schools. I mean, of course, there's still Catholic schools today, but many, many Catholic children, the vast majority, I believe, go to public schools. Well, then this was felt that the Catholic schools were somehow un-American. Then finally, if you look at the building in the back on the left, Tammany Hall. That's what the city hall, the municipal government is referred to in New York City at this time. And look on top of the dome, that's a Christian cross, that's representing the Catholics. And look, the two flags, those are the papal flags representing the Pope. So in other words, there's fear that, the Catholics are taking over. Okay. Now, what was the main concern of the Protestants against the Catholics? And that was that the Catholics, supposedly, their primary loyalty was to the Pope in the Vatican, not the United States government. In other words, the Catholics were Catholics first and Americans second. And of course, there are other factors such as there's been for centuries, the English had looked down on the Irish. Ireland was sort of a plantation colony, well, not a colony, but part of England. And so you had that. And this strong, strong anti-Catholic sentiment, we'll see as we move along in the course, it continued. You'll probably be surprised when we look at the 1920s to find out that the Ku Klux Klan was strongly anti-Catholic. And in fact, well, of course, it was still anti-black, but its primary focus turned to the Catholics as un-American. And it was still a major factor in 1960 when John Fitzgerald Kennedy was nominated to be the Democratic candidate, and he was Catholic from Boston. And at one point in the campaign, he even stood on the steps of the Catholic Cathedral, St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. He stood there with the Catholic, it was a bishop or cardinal, who assured everybody that if Kennedy were elected, he would not be speaking for the church, but rather his religion would be a private matter, and he would, represent himself as president of the United States. Now let's look a minute at the Chinese Americans. In 1880, there were about 75,000 in California, 12% of the population. And we know earlier that some came over during the gold rush in 1849. Like everybody else who went to the San Francisco area, they wanted to become wealthy and leave. And then some came over and many stayed to work on building the railroads, etc. Now, this was the first non-European or non-African group to come to the United States in significant numbers. In 1882, the Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act to prohibit Chinese workers from coming to the United States. Now, this is a political cartoon from the time, and you can see the Chinese man is being pushed out of the schoolroom, and it's called Miss Columbia School, and the woman is dressed up to sort of represent the United States, and the article calls him John Chinaman, and you can read at the bottom, "Be just, even to John Chinaman." And what is John Chinaman carrying? Well, he has an ironing board in his right hand, an iron in his, an iron for clothes in his left hand, and an opium pipe. Okay. Now behind the teacher, you have one student who says, "Kick out heathen." Heathen means non-Christians. He's got no vote. But it's interesting, you see the black student in the back, so a very negative caricature of the black student, large lips. But in this cartoon, he's certainly more acceptable than the Chinese. He's not being pushed out. You see behind him sort of a caricature of someone from India, which is interesting because there weren't very few Indians. And you see someone who's sort of German or whatever behind the school teacher. So this sort of represents the Chinese. Now the question is, and something I like to explore for 2 or 3 minutes, this was not excluding all Asians, only the Chinese. As I mentioned, it only excluded Chinese workers, not other Asians. And there were 2 large or major reasons for this. First is the Japanese were greatly admired in the United States by most people at this time, and there were a number of Japanese who'd already come to the United States, and particularly in California, started farming. One well-known professor at the time claimed that the Japanese were, quote, "the most progressive people of the Mongolian race." Now, why? Well, if you remember back to the 1850s, you may or may not recall that U.S. Admiral Perry arrived in Japan in 1853 and sort of opened up Japan for trade, and Japan had been closed for trade for about 200 years. And the Americans were just delighted that the Japanese very quickly adapted many of the American customs. They wanted to learn English. They wanted to switch to American style clothing. They wanted to send their children to study in the U.S. And, this was very flattering, obviously, for the Americans. And then there was a war between China and Japan in the 1870s, between China and Japan in the 1870s, and the Japanese won. That was seen as another confirmation of Japanese superiority. Now, in marked contrast, The Chinese remained isolationist. They did not want to adopt Western clothes, food, mannerisms. And so it was felt in the United States that, well, the Japanese immigrants who came over could be assimilated. They wanted to be, quote, American. They wanted to learn the American culture and about the American political institutions, but the Chinese, the feeling was, were impossible to assimilate in the US. So that's one of the two major reasons is, in contrast with the Chinese simply could not be assimilated. The other, and I think equally important reason, was the Keele System, and the Chinese were viewed by many people, including the most liberal progressive people, as sort of de facto slaves. Let me explain the Keele System for a minute. You may not have heard of it. You may recall that in 1833, Britain abolished slavery throughout its empire. Obviously, there was some slavery in Britain, people, household servants, but British Empire extended around the world, as the British were proud to say at the time. The sun never set on the British Empire. And in many, many of its colonies, the British had used slaves. Well, in 1833, because of pressure from abolitionists, the British Parliament decided to abolish slavery. And of course, the United States continued to have slavery for another 30 years. Well, just let's focus on Britain and its colonies for a moment. So Britain had very lucrative plantations all around the world that had relied on slaves. They had sugar plantations in Jamaica. They had all sorts of plantations in India. They had plantations and mines. So what they decided to do was, since they couldn't bring any more slaves over because the slave trade was abolished and slavery, they decided to take workers from China and India to work on these plantations. So in our hemisphere, you had the Chinese taken to Peru, where they worked largely in the very wealthy silver mines, or they worked along the coast on the plantations for cotton and some other crops. And then many Chinese went to Cuba for the lucrative plantations there. They were owned by British people. Now, how were they transported from China to the Western Hemisphere? Well, they came over on ships that had been used to transport slaves, because you had Britain had a massive number of ships that were involved in transporting slaves around the world. Well, all of a sudden, slavery is illegal, and these slave ships were seen as the perfect means to transport these Chinese. Now, many Americans saw what was happening. Now, this is before the U.S. Civil War, so we still had slavery in the United States. And they protested. They said, they protested slavery in the United States. They thought it was great that Britain had legally abolished the slave trade and slavery in its entire empire. But they said that they're creating a new type of forced labor or slavery in the British colonies because the coolies, as they called them, which comes from an Indian word, they went as indentured servants. You'll recall from American colonial history, an indentured servant for American colonies was someone who came over from England, a very poor person, and they were given free ship passage, and in return they had to sign a contract to work a certain number of years, usually 5 to 7 years, at the end of which time they were supposed to receive farming tools and a certain number of acres. And, many of them, or some of them did, and some of them didn't. Some died, from the diseases or whatnot. But the indentured system was much harsher for the Chinese. Let's go to the next slide, discuss that. Okay. For those who came to the United States, and this also applies for the British colonies, but let's leave Britain alone since this is, of course, in U.S. history. They came to the U.S. not as slaves, technically. They weren't like African slaves, legally, technically. They came as indentured labor. And the American consuls in China had to have them certify that they were voluntarily going, and they had a contract to work, a set number of years to repay their ship fare. The ship fare from Asia to the United States, which is obviously quite expensive. The only problem is they got to the United States and their extremely low wages were never sufficient to repay their ship fare. They were barely sufficient to buy food and a few clothes. When they got here, before they left China, they were really treated like cattle because they had their backs stamped, like branded, so they couldn't escape. They put it in, because for the Anglos in the U.S., they all look the same was their thought, so they put some sort of sign stamped to their back so they could identify them. Now, once they got here and started working as an indentured laborer, many, or some think the majority, died of disease, hard work, or a combination before the indenture period expired. Now, you got to remember, at this time, there were many, many diseases. Many people were dying of all sorts of diseases, but it's aggravated, obviously, for the Chinese coolies because they're working extremely hard. They're not, they don't have proper living conditions, and they're not receiving good food. And as regards their transportation from the Pacific, it's very similar to, you'll recall, the so-called Middle Passage of the African slaves from Africa to the Western Hemisphere, where many died. Well, it's estimated that as many or even more Chinese coolies died crossing the Pacific. First of all, it's a much longer voyage. It's been well documented on some of the ships, 40% died, other ships 20 to 30%. So it reminded many Americans who had vigorously opposed the slave trade of the slave trade. And they were also transported on former slave trading ships, many times owned by wealthy British people. So the net result of this is many Americans who had protested slavery before the Civil War, now, after the Civil War, they suspected that a new form of slavery was developing in the United States, and that slavery was based in the coolie trade. And not only did they oppose the coolie trade on moral grounds for slavery, they also feared that if continued, it could lead to another type of civil war in the United States where the states that had a lot of Chinese would fight to protect them. So in 1879, just a few years before the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed by the U.S. Congress, the California state constitution was amended to read, quote, "Asiatic coolieism is a form of human slavery and is forever prohibited in this state." Now, the Chinese Exclusion Act, when passed in 1882, expired after 10 years, and it was renewed by Congress in 1892. The e-reader article in this module deals with the extension of the act, and the e-reader article is 2 pages long, and it's taken from a U.S. House of Representatives official publication prepared for the representatives to inform them before the vote. And as you read through it, you can see it doesn't really talk about a new form of slavery. It talks about the low wages, et cetera, et cetera. It's, today we view it as extremely racist what's in there, and and the vices of the Chinese. And it said the few Chinese women who came over are mainly prostitutes. So be sure and read that e-reader article. Now, the Chinese Exclusion Act was renewed in 1892, and it was only revoked in 1943. And that was when China was the American ally fighting against Japan during World War II. And the Chinese government said, we will not accept the fact that you exclude all of our workers from going to the United States when we are fighting alongside American forces against Japan. So it was revoked in 1943. Now, if we just zoom forward to today, all the data suggests that of the racial groups in the United States, Asian Americans are by far the wealthiest Asian group. And of course, Asian Americans here includes not just Chinese, but Japanese and South Asians, people from India, Pakistan, whatnot. Okay, that concludes the lecture on urban America and some of the migration. In the next lecture, we'll look at reform in the Gilded Age. Thank you.